Doyle in London. So, Chris, what do you think, how effective do you think, rather, these sanctions could be?
Well, these sanctions will be another attempt to purportedly hold the Syrian regime account. And that is laudable to the extent that the Syrian regime, of course, is responsible for egregious crimes, human rights abuses, whether it's the deliberate targeting of civilians over the last 10 years of this awful war, mass arrests, the torture, etc. And of course, the Caesar Act itself is named after the pseudonym of the Syrian who brought these ghastly photographs of Syrians being tortured and detained in Syria. But I think there has to be very serious questions about how effective this is going to be.
So,
the Syrian regime
no,
has
go ahead.
adapted.
Go ahead.
The Syrian regime has adapted to all of these sanctions before. So the cronies right at the top have smuggling networks and accounts in countries that won't be affected by it. They are going to be they're going to be quite content with this.
So
the trouble is,
why then?
Well, the United States, has wanted to put together a policy of maximum pressure on Iran and its allies, and of course that includes Syria. It includes Hezbollah, and this is another plank in that particular strategy. And as you see with Iran, there is actually precious little account, really, for the humanitarian well-being of those peoples. And we're going to see this in Syria, because whilst the regime will survive this, the people, the Syrian people, the civilians, are going to be caught between two immovable rocks. The rock of the regime and all the things that it does to oppress the Syrian people, deny its freedom, the incompetence of its economic management, and then the rock of sanctions, which will also prove, if history shows us anything, that they will also be immovable. And it will make it very difficult, because the economy won't be able to provide for the people. It won't be able to provide the money to be able to import products. So you can have exemptions, but unless the Syrian economy is able to boost production, it won't be able to buy these medicines.
So
it won't have the purchasing.
You're describing a situation where the sanctions often end up hurting the most vulnerable, even if there are so-called exemptions in the sanctions.
The exemptions tend to take a long time. These sanctions will put off a lot of companies who might otherwise get engaged in these, because they're determined that it's far too risky, because they will have business in the United States. Perhaps they're going to move away from dealing with Syria. We already see this in the way that bank accounts belonging to Syrians, for example, in Europe, are closed. The risk is just too much for those banks to have Syrian account holders. So what I fear we'll see, because we've seen it, for example, with the sanctions on Iraq that were in place between 1990 and 2003. The Saddam Hussein regime basically dealt with those sanctions quite effectively as far as its own narrow interests were concerned, and it actually used the sanctions as an instrument of oppression on its own people. And of course, the Syrian regime will be saying the economic crisis, the humanitarian crisis in Syria is all the fault of the sanctions. And the United States will be saying the economic humanitarian crisis is all the fault of the regime. But that won't get us anywhere. That will not be able to push forward some sort of resolution to a crisis that's lasted over 10 years.
Indeed. Chris Doyle, thank you so much for joining us from London. Appreciate it.